Ever looked at a job description for like a housing policy officer and been like, okay, sounds interesting, but what do they actually do all day?
It can be surprisingly vague.
Yeah, like it'll say stuff
Uh,
about developing housing strategies, but like how? With what?
right. So a lot of buzzwords, not a lot of concrete details.
Exactly. So that's what we're diving into today, trying to give you the real deal on what this career path looks like beyond the jargon.
And we've got some pretty cool resources to help us out.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of RoleCatcher.com?
I have, yeah. It's like they're trying to be the go-to place for anyone serious about their job hunt.
Right. They've got this crazy detailed guide on becoming a housing policy officer, which is what we're mainly looking at today.
But it's not just like a one-time thing. They've got all sorts of other tools too, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, tons. Resume building, interview prep, even salary insights, the whole nine yards.
It's almost overwhelming, honestly. Like, where do you even begin?
That's actually something I like about their approach, though. They seem to really get that choosing a career path, it's not just about finding any old job.
It's got to be the right fit for you.
Exactly. Like, what are your values? What are you good at? What do you actually enjoy?
And that's where their housing policy officer guide comes in. Because it's not just about, here are the steps to get hired. They really dig into what this job is about on like a fundamental level.
Yeah, like that whole idea of community engagement, which I feel like is a huge part of housing policy.
Oh, absolutely. You're not just crunching numbers in a vacuum. You're working directly with people.
Right. I was actually just reading an article about how when cities try to implement new zoning laws, those resident feedback sessions are crucial.
Oh, totally. Because people have strong opinions about their neighborhoods.
You better believe it. And housing policy officers need to be able to navigate those dynamics, which can get really complex.
For sure. And RoleCatcher actually calls that out specifically. Like, they even have example interview questions based around stakeholder engagement.
Oh, yeah. Like, how would you address the needs of both residents and developers, even if they clash? Stuff like that, which you definitely want to be prepared for.
Right. It's not something you can just wing on the spot.
Definitely not. And that whole emphasis on collaboration, it just highlights how vital communication skills are in this line of work.
I mean, you're constantly interacting with, who is it? Government agencies, nonprofits, developers, residents themselves. The list goes on.
It's like the ultimate balancing act.
Pretty much. You're trying to find solutions that work for as many people as possible, which is no easy feat.
And it makes me think about things like the Fair Housing Act.
Oh, yeah. Huge.
Because it's one thing for a housing policy officer to understand the legislation itself, but they also need to be able to explain it clearly to others.
Totally. And
And-
make sure it's actually being implemented fairly, which is a whole other challenge.
Exactly. Okay, so we've established that housing policy, it's about making a real difference. But like any job, it's not all sunshine and roses.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. There are definitely some downsides or at least challenges that come with the territory.
And I appreciate that RealCatcher doesn't shy away from that. Like, they lay out the pros and cons in a very upfront way.
Yeah. Which I really respect
Yeah.
because it shows they're not just trying to sell you on this career path.
They want you to go in with your eyes wide open.
Exactly. So what did they highlight? I'm curious what they listed as potential drawbacks.
Well, they talk about how obviously the work can be incredibly rewarding, like you're helping to create positive change in your community.
Which is huge, right? Like
Yeah.
that sense of purpose is not something you find in every job.
Totally. But they also acknowledge that there can be a lot of red tape involved.
Bureaucracy,
Mm,
the enemy of efficiency.
pretty much. And they mention that sometimes policy implementation can move at a snail's pace.
Yeah, that can be frustrating for sure, especially if you're someone who likes to see quick results.
Right. And then there's the whole political side of things.
Oh, right. Because depending on where you work and what the political climate is like, that could definitely add another layer of complexity.
Exactly. Like, how do you navigate those external pressures, especially if you don't necessarily agree with them?
That's a tough one for sure, and it really highlights how housing policy is this constantly evolving field.
You gotta be on your toes at all times.
For sure. Like one day, you might be working on a program related to, I don't know, affordable housing development, and the next day you're dealing with the fallout from some new rent control measure.
And you gotta be knowledgeable about all of it.
Right. Which is why they suggest things like joining organizations like the National Housing Conference or staying up to date on publications like Housing Policy Debate.
So it's like you're never really done learning.
Pretty much. You're kind of a lifelong student of housing, which could be really cool if you're passionate about it.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about the day-to-day, the challenges. the importance of staying informed. But what about the actual career trajectory? Like, how do you climb that ladder?
Well, RoleCatcher actually lays that all out really well, which I was impressed by.
Okay, good, because I was hoping we could dig into that.
Yeah, for sure. So they break it down by experience level, from entry level all the way up to senior, and they show how your responsibilities kind of shift as you gain more experience.
That makes sense. I mean, you're not going to be drafting policy proposals fresh out of college, probably.
Right. There's got to be some kind of learning curve.
Exactly. So let's say you're like just graduated, maybe you have a degree in public policy or urban planning, something like that. What does an entry-level housing policy officer actually do?
So at that stage, it's a lot of foundational work,
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
like you might be doing research on existing housing policies and regulations, things like that.
Got it.
Or maybe you're collecting and analyzing data to kind of get a handle on housing trends in a particular area.
So it's a lot of like behind the scenes stuff, but still super important.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because you can't really contribute meaningfully until you understand the landscape, right?
Makes sense.
And this is where those analytical skills come in handy. You're learning how to interpret data, spot trends, all of that good stuff.
So you're not just like filing papers or whatever.
Yeah. No, you're definitely using your brain. It's more about building that knowledge base early on.
Okay, that makes sense. And then what about the next step? Like you've put in the time, you've learned the ropes, you're ready for that junior housing policy officer role. What changes?
So this is where you start to get a little more autonomy, a little more responsibility.
Okay, yeah.
You might be tasked with analyzing existing policies, maybe identifying areas for improvement.
So you're not just following the rules anymore, you're starting to think critically about them.
Exactly. And you might even contribute to the development of new programs or initiatives.
Oh, that's cool. So you're actually starting to have an impact at that stage.
Yeah, definitely. And your communication skills become even more important because now you might be presenting your findings to colleagues, writing policy briefs, maybe even interacting with stakeholders to gather feedback.
It's getting real.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you need to be able to explain complex ideas clearly and concisely, and you need to be able to handle yourself in those meetings.
I bet. And then what's after junior, mid-level?
Yep, you got it. Mid-level housing policy officer. So at that point, you're kind of like the project lead, I guess. You're leading those research projects. You're collaborating with stakeholders to actually implement programs.
So you're really in the thick of it now.
Oh, yeah. And you're responsible for making sure those programs are actually effective, which means monitoring their impact, making adjustments as needed, all of that.
That's a lot of pressure.
It is, but it's also really exciting.
Yeah.
Because you're starting to see your ideas come to life.
Right. And is this also where people start to specialize a bit more? Like maybe they're really passionate about affordable housing development or something specific like that?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Because by that point, you've kind of figured out what you're good at, what you enjoy.
Right, where your strengths lie.
Exactly. So maybe, like you said, you focus on affordable housing development. Maybe you're working with programs like the low-income housing tax credit, things like that.
Oh, that makes sense.
Or maybe you're more drawn to community development. So you're looking at policies that promote equitable neighborhood revitalization, things like
There's
that.
so many different avenues you could go down.
There really are. And this is also where that whole lifelong learning thing comes in handy, because if you want to specialize, you got to stay up to date on the latest research, best practices, all that.
Right, because I'm assuming there are new studies and reports and stuff coming out all the time.
Constantly. Which is why RoleCatcher, they actually emphasize the importance of continuing education, whether that's pursuing, I don't know, advanced degrees, certifications, attending conferences, things like that.
It's like you're always a student in a way.
In a good way, though,
Mm,
because it keeps things interesting,
totally. Okay, so we've gone from entry level to mid-level. What's the peak of the mountain? What are we striving for?
Senior housing policy officer, baby. That's the big leagues.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What does a senior housing policy officer actually do?
So at this point, you're not just an expert. You're kind of like a thought leader.
Yeah.
You're the one developing those strategic housing policies that are tackling those really complex systemic challenges.
So you're thinking big picture, long term.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You might be leading a whole team of housing policy officers. You're probably advising senior leadership on all things housing. You might even be advocating for policy changes at the local, state, even national level.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is, but it's also incredibly impactful, Like you have the potential to shape housing policy in a really meaningful way.
And I imagine you've got to have a deep understanding of not just housing itself, but also economics, politics, all sorts of things.
Oh, absolutely. It's like this intersection of so many different fields, which is what makes it so challenging and rewarding.
For sure. And RoleCatcher does a good job, like we said, of breaking all these stages down.
Yeah, and you know what I thought was really cool? They have these little example profile sections sprinkled throughout.
Oh, what are those like?
So they basically showcase the career paths of real-life housing policy officers.
Oh, that's a cool idea.
Right. Because it's one thing to read a list of responsibilities. It's another to see how someone actually built their career in this field.
Totally. Give me an example.
So, for example, they profile this one senior housing policy officer. She started her career working on homelessness prevention programs.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. Then she moved into affordable housing development, and then she eventually became like this leading voice in advocating for more equitable housing policies at the state level.
That's incredible.
It is really inspiring, right? And it shows that there's no one right path.
Like you can come from all sorts of backgrounds and end up making a huge difference.
Exactly. And I think that's something RoleCatcher really tries to emphasize throughout their guide.
It's about demystifying the whole process a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Making it feel more accessible, more achievable.
Okay, so we've talked about the career ladder, but RoleCatcher offers a lot more than just that, right? Like they've got all these tools to actually help you find and land a job. It's funny, we've been talking about all this like career stuff, the different levels, the skills you need.
Right.
But it just hit me how at the core of all of this, it's really about people.
Oh, absolutely.
Like real people finding safe, affordable places to live.
Yeah, it's not just about numbers and regulations on a page. It's about someone having a decent place to call home.
Exactly. And RoleCatcher actually touches on this in their FAQ section, which I thought was really cool.
Oh, yeah. What do they say?
So they have this one questions like, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about housing policy? And one of the things they highlight is this idea that affordable housing just means building more units.
Right, like just throw up some buildings and call it a day.
Yeah, but they're like, no, it's way more nuanced than that. It's about creating communities that are actually livable.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Because it's not enough to just have a roof over your head. You need access to transportation, green spaces, good schools for your kids if you have them.
All of that. And they didn't shy away from the challenges either. Like they even talked about NBEARism.
Oh, yeah, the not in my backyard thing.
Exactly. And how sometimes communities resist new development, even if it's desperately needed.
Which is tough because on the one hand, I get it, people like their neighborhoods the way they are.
Right. They don't want things to change.
But on the other hand, we need to create more housing, especially affordable housing. And that means sometimes building in new areas.
Totally. And that's where a housing policy officer needs those serious diplomacy skills.
For sure, because you're trying to balance all these different perspectives, find solutions that work for as many people as possible.
Which is no easy task.
Not at all. It takes a lot of empathy, like really listening to people's concerns, even if you don't agree with them.
And a willingness to compromise. Because you're probably not going to make everyone happy all the time. It's funny thinking back to all the stuff RoleCatcher offers, the career guide, the tools, the whole shebang.
It's a lot.
It really is. But I think what they're trying to do is give people a leg up.
Sure.
Like, here's everything we know about how to succeed in this field.
It's like they're saying, we've been there, we get it, and we want to help.
Exactly. And honestly, that kind of support can make all the difference, especially if you're just starting out.
Totally. Because choosing a career path, it's a big deal. It's a big decision.
Huge.
And you want to make sure you're set up for success.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we've thoroughly dissected the world of housing policy today.
I think we have. From entry level all the way to the top of the food chain, we covered it all.
We did. So for anyone out there who's listening, who's thinking, yeah, maybe housing policy, IS my thing, hopefully this gave you some food for thought.
And some concrete steps you can take to learn more, right?
Exactly. All right. This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.